And we are live, and we're live, and we're live under the lights. We are ready to go. Tuesday night taking over here at VodPod Media. Big shout out to Guyline. You better call the Mayor Jackson and get him on the show because we're live tonight. We're having some fun taking over your Tuesday night wherever you're watching from. If you're watching live, go ahead and comment. Give us a share. Give us a like. Give us a note about where you're watching from because we've got a very special show tonight. And before I introduce our boxing intellect guest, I've got to give a very special shout out to the Ophelia Delgado Law Firm. Let me tell you folks, if you're looking for your personal injury attorney, look no further. Check her out at Delgado Law Firm. Find her on the internet. Call us, DM us. We're going to get you connected because you got to get connected with some of the best. That's what we do here at VodPod. That's what we do here at the Maximo Show. And so speaking of the best, I got to introduce you my good friend. Find him on Twitter, the boxing intellect, Dr. Rudy Mondragón. Brother, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm here with you guys, so I can't complain. I'm taking a break from the work and just get to chop it up about the things that I love. So I can't complain, man. I'm happy to be here, bro.
And so, listen, we love to have inspiring people on. People always ask me, well, what's your show about? What's this podcast about? Well, we don't have a theme per se. We do culture, we do people, we do power talks. And that's right up your alley, my brother. And, you and I have been talking about a long time about getting together, doing work. And so this is what we do, right? I'm in the business of communicating. You're in the business of storytelling, of influence and policy, and in the business of boxing, which is our people's language. So big shout out to all of our boxing fans. And we're going to get to a little bit more into the homie's background here in just a second. But brother, I got to just check in with you, man. How you doing tonight, man? How you living? Because you just told me before we turned on, and went live that you can't complain. And I got to give a shout out to everybody that's manifesting their dreams, right? Because nothing's given, man. Nothing's promised, man. We got to make our own way out here, right? Which ain't easy to do. And you sound like you're on that path.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, the path started for me back in 1992 on the night that Julio Cesar Chavez fought against Hector Macho Camacho. And I didn't know 10, 15 years, 20 years later that was my calling. It was always been my passion, but I always thought of boxing as a hobby. And the reason why I was sharing with you earlier that I can't complain is because the idea of manifesting, the idea of just taking a risk and following what your heart is telling you is the right thing to do. Oftentimes, I think for me, it was not trusting my gut and it was minimizing what my gut was telling me, what my heart was telling me, that boxing is something that you can transform to work for you. And, I'm a professor. I got a PhD in Chicano and Chicana and Central American Studies from UCLA. And I created this project looking at Black and brown boxers, centering their stories that are manifested and shared in their ring entrances, and then moving into how I can influence policy by looking at the political economy of boxing. So when I say that I can't complain, it's because I've turned my workplace into my home space. And for me, talking about boxing, researching boxing, building community with the boxing community is fun work that I get to do, but very important and rigorous work at the same time. So I can't complain because I breathe, I live, and I eat boxing on a regular basis.
Well, yeah, man.
7-year-old Rudy.
Hey, I appreciate that, and much respect to that because you've created your own lane. You've made a space for yourself, and you're doing what you love, which is inspiring no matter what language, whether you like boxing, whether you're into real estate, whether you're into, creative projects. I mean, that's what this is about. And so, let's get right into it, man. You talked about the sociological aspect of boxing. Let's talk about the historical aspect of what boxing has meant to communities of color. I mean, you could talk about some of the giants in this country, some of those original fighters that fought their way to freedom, by fighting and finding their own way. What is it about boxing, man, that has captivated, this country and the world?
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, boxing is like the idea of battle, the idea of fighting people are always fighting for something, fighting against something, whether they're resisting or defending themselves. I think a lot of people tend to talk about that, but I think the cultural element, the sociological element, is that boxing is very different than Major League Baseball, than the National Basketball Association, which we just, watched the Lakers get a great win last night against the Golden State Warriors. Shout out to the Lakers. Boxing is different from those sports because every single boxer, which is something that Robert Guerrero, the Ghost, told me, a Chicano fighter from Gilroy, California. He said every single boxer has to create a franchise, and no boxer is stepping into a tradition. No boxer stepping into a brand. They create all those things, and when you do brand culture, it's an extension of who you are, your lived experiences, whether it's your race, whether it's your ethnicity, your culture, your gender, the neighborhood you grew up in, the country that you rep. And so it's storytelling, and I think people relate to those stories. Like with Julio Cesar Chavez, a lot of people related to his working class ethos. When it came to Jack Johnson, right? You have to talk about Jack Johnson when you talk about boxing. If you don't talk about Jack Johnson, then we're not really digging deep enough into the history of boxing. Jack Johnson represented, not only was the first black heavyweight champion in the world, but he represented an alternative to a Jim Crow era that he lived in. And so to perform manhood and blackness in an unapologetic way, people saw him and Joe Louis as these phantasmatic figures that were able to do things that the average black man in America during that Jim Crow era couldn't do. And so they were heroes. They were superheroes in a time where people needed that kind of relatability, that kind of hope that was embodied by figures like that. And so I think it's the storytelling. It's how you bring your full self to a boxing arena, to a gym, and then people latch on to those things. And I think that's why people have very distinct relationships with the boxers that they support, whether it was in the 1980s and the 70s, the era of the Four Horsemen, or the Tyson era, or the Chavez era, Joe Louis era, Muhammad Ali. There's some story that the fans latch on to and that they follow, and that's powerful, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, a lot of people, again, whether you like boxing, whether you don't like boxing, you talk about the storytelling. I mean, think about the film Rocky, the Rocky franchise, which is still going to this day, right? With the Creed, stories and films that are coming out. I mean, you don't even have to be a boxing fan, but you're compelled. Something about the physical manifestation of fighting and achieving and championships. I mean, that speaks to people's souls, right? And again, you talk about people of color. If you're a young brown or black kid, you see it yourself as a champion through these guys' fights, right? You're representing something bigger than yourself, somebody that looks like you, that's in your family, that comes from, an underrepresented community, that comes from poverty, that comes from struggle. It's like, that's who we are, right? When you see Canelo, who is Mexican, you see him fighting this past weekend and you see him winning. Great fight. I want to get your feedback on the fight in a bit, but you see these fighters, you mentioned Chavez. In my era, it was De La Hoya from Southern California, right? When you saw this guy who was just doing it, right? Putting it down, who was skilled. It's like when you see the work of somebody who is really skilled. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a painter or whether it's a pianist, whether it's a good singer. You don't know, you may not be an aficionado, but you can tell this is smooth. This is good, like a good wine, right? Watching those fighters.
Damn. I could use a good glass of wine right now, actually, now that you mentioned that. What you're saying to me, like, it's interesting because when you think about Rocky, it's like going back to the sociological or like just society, and how boxing and boxing film is a reflection of certain social political issues that are of the time. Like, so when Rocky comes out, it is this working class white hero that gets lifted up. But if you look at the rankings and the champions of that era, no heavyweight champion in that era was white. You know what I'm saying? And so the story, then you look at Rocky and you're like, okay, what is the narrative that's being advanced here? And it's during the time that Larry Bird rises as a Celtics player for Boston. It's this time where like white men are beginning to feel like they have a loss of industry, a loss of purpose, a loss of manhood. And Rocky serves as this movie that lifts up the narrative of the white working class male hero. You know what I'm saying? And so that, and then when you think about the other part that I was thinking about, like skills, like Chavez, like that era, like when we think about skills, like oftentimes we think about Mexican style as a form of brawling, a form of just like 2 punches, 3 punches to land one of your own. It's very like a style that's kind of advanced by people who talk about it as not a skill that's high, a style of fighting that's not highly skilled. And I take a problem with that, because how much in our society do we look at agricultural workers and we say that they're not
unskilled labor,
which justifies the underpayments of those workers? And how does that also tie into boxing when you say Mexican style and you kind of paint it with a broad stroke, right? And you don't think about like, what does it require for a brawler to fight in a strategic way that is their strength to lead a fight like that? Like Maidana is a type of brawler, that type of skill, that type of strategy to beat Adrian Broner, right? Or to give Floyd Mayweather a very, very tough fight. That's a unique skill that, for example, Floyd Mayweather would not be able to implement, because that's not his style. But they're distinct styles that require different types of skill sets.
Yeah. And listen, I'm with you. I take offense to that too, of that brawling style of Mexicans. I mean, and I want to get your take on that too, because there's been so many iconic Mexican boxers that we've seen, and all of them, whether you had a great record, undefeated or whatever it may be, they're all legends, you know, really, for them to make it to have brand recognition of their name. But we talked about this last week. And again, we know Canelo only fights on 2 weekends, which is more of a marketing thing. He fights on the Mexican Independence Day, which is in September, and he fights on Cinco de Mayo weekend. You know, he has found a way through his camp, through his promotion, to, you know, monetize and work in this country, in this continent, the world really, to capitalize off that warrior spirit that we have running through our veins. To me, it ain't a brawler. It ain't a brawler that's really that the Mexican style. It is someone who is headstrong, who is going to come forward, you have to stop them in order to put them down, right? I mean, we talked about that liver shot that homeboy took a couple weekends ago. It's going to take a shot like that to put him down, you know, because they're going to keep coming. You know, there's been a phrase in boxing. It's like fight like a Mexican. And that's because, I mean, these guys are tougher than nails. I mean, they have that warrior spirit. It's in the blood, man. Cinco de Mayo represented a group of underdog, you know, ragtag soldiers that overcome French colonial forces. They were outnumbered, but it didn't matter, because they had that just, we don't care, we coming forward anyway. To me, that's the Mexican spirit. That's the Mexican fighter right there manifested.
Right. And I think any Mexican fighter can embody a Mexican spirit, a warrior spirit that we talk about. And then the way we talk about Mexican style as we water that down, what that really means. And then speaking about Canelo and his fight that he just had this past weekend, he's been very adamant in interviews to tell the media that I do not fight in a Mexican style, because he's responding to the ways in which Mexican style has been, you know, very homogenized and very much so essentialized to embody characteristics and not necessarily the skills. Like, let's truly break that down. Like, I remember Fernando Vargas when he fought against Oscar De La Hoya in 2002, and he was embodying a narrative, a spirit of Mexican style. And then years later, right, they interview him and they compare him and his style to Brandon Rios, who is known as a Mexican brawler type boxer, come forward, takes a lot of punches during his career to be able to get close and get within punching reach of his opponent. Fernando Vargas stopped the media interviewer and said, I'm not similar to that. I'm not a Mexican brawler like that. I'm a boxer puncher. And so then when we think about that conversation of what style does a fighter have, and you break it down, and that's a very simple way of breaking it down, like a boxer puncher. What does that even mean? I use my boxing, Fernando Vargas said, to set up my power punches. That to me sounds like there's intellect, there's strategy, and there's a recognition of one's assets to use them inside the ring.
Absolutely. And I went to school in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and around there, you go to any boxing gym, you got the whole walls are wallpapered with Floyd Mayweather. And so we know there's numerous ways to bake a cake. And the Mayweather family, I mean, out in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a lot of gyms. But, you know, again, what skills did he have as an athlete? More of a finesse style, right? More of a defensive style later in his years versus more of the, you know, the quick hands and knocking people out. You know, again, broke his hand. A guy like Mayweather, Floyd Jr. broke his hand, had to adapt and do some different things. As an athlete, a very gifted athlete, he could do that. You know, Canelo, as you mentioned, you know, I want to get your feedback on the fight. You know, a very entertaining fight. You know, the brother Ryder that he fought, really tough guy. And, you know, one thing I like about Canelo, he takes on all comers. He's going to fight you. He'll fight you numerous times. He'll move up. He'll move down. You know, he floored the brother twice before the 8th round. In the 9th round, it got ugly. They were duking it out. And I thought, you know, he took some shots. It looks like Canelo's is getting a little bit older, maybe a little slower. I mean, he's had a ton of fights. Give me your feedback on the fight.
I mean, I knew just going into the fight, I knew it was more spectacle than competitive matchup. At least that's what I thought going into the fight. You know, the mariachi, there was like 40, 50, 60 deep singing Canelo out. It was a homecoming, fighting in Guadalajara at the Akron. Yeah. So all that stuff, I was like, you know what, the opponent is not as significant as this story, as this big event that was going to take place in Guadalajara. And I thought the first 6 rounds for Ryder were strategic, like kind of try to take Canelo into the later rounds, knowing that Canelo has shown signs of fatiguing in the second half of the fight, particularly the fights that he had against Triple G. And so I thought his strategy was a smart one, like, you know, sustain as much punishment, avoid as much punishment that Canelo was going to try to dish out with his power punches and his body shots, which, by the way, for those that didn't notice it, I think a lot of people did notice it, though, but that boxing ring was tiny.
So they had a smaller ring than typically?
I want to say that was a smaller ring than what you typically see, like in the state of California or Nevada. I think that ring was smaller. And I mean, I literally got messages from friends telling me if the boxing ring, if they were fighting inside a crib. I mean, that's how small the ring looked. And maybe it was the optics. Maybe it was a regular size ring. But I want to say that the ring was a little bit smaller, which makes sense because Canelo, for his style, when you have a fighter that sits on their punches, you don't want a jumpy ring. You don't want something that's going to help you move around, which is what Floyd Mayweather would want to. He'd want a big ring that has more pop to it so that you can move around and explore the geography of the ring. I think Canelo had a soft ring that allows you to set your feet on the ground, and it was a smaller ring because it allows him to cut the ring and not let the opponent wander into too many spaces in the ring. That's what it looked like to me, the geography of the ring. And so Canelo did what I expected Canelo to do, especially in the first half of the fight when he hurt Ryder. And I thought he was going to be able to finish him off. At times, I thought Canelo kind of took his foot off the gas to try to carry the fight into some of the later rounds, because in the beginning, it did look like Ryder was seconds away from being finished. But Ryder rode the storm and made it happen to go the distance. And then I thought Canelo also slowed down quite a bit, like after the 8th round or so, which gave Ryder some openings. I mean, he caught him with some good straights and uppercut combinations. And I think you're right in terms of Canelo getting a little older. He's 32 years old now. He's been fighting since he was 16, I think, as a professional. So that's a 16-plus year career already that he has under his belt as a professional. So I thought it should have been an easier fight for Canelo, but it was. So it was also like he won comfortably on the scorecards. And it's just the levels that one has. Like, a Ryder doesn't have the skill set to give Canelo a competitive fight, but he does have just enough to be. And these are terminology that we use in the boxing world, right? Which are ways to define a human commodity, right? Ryder is a durable fighter. Ryder is the type of fighter that will fall short against big names, which he has in the past, but will go the distance or give a good fight. These are things I think that matchmakers look for in order to effectively match a fighter like Canelo, a star fighter like Canelo, in order to create a fight that will appear competitive, appear entertaining, and would be good for business, because you don't want someone that's just gonna, be an easy picking for Canelo, because then the media and a lot of fans would just have a lot to talk about and critique the fight. But in this case, it adds to the narrative. Ryder was game. He was a tough opponent, but Canelo himself said it. If I lose to Ryder, my ass is retiring. There's a reason why that was said before the fight.
Yeah, and listen, the reason I wanted to ask you about the Canelo fight. He just fought this past weekend. It was an easy segue because we're talking about Mexican boxers. Yeah. Listen, Canelo's done. He's had a great career, right? I mean, when it's all said and done, you could put his resume up against just about any other Mexican boxers. One of my good friends, Ricky Jenkins, who's from Ohio, man, this guy is a sport aficionado, man. He loves, sport. He loves boxing. If he's watching, Ricky, I hope you're doing well. He told me a long time ago that his favorite boxer ever was Alexis Arguellos. And I was like, wow, man, I was surprised kind of that he knew him and that he talked about, that guy's resume and what he did during his time in the ring and even out of the ring for a little while. I think he got into politics, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Really quickly, again, we got a lot of questions to ask you, but it's a pleasure having you on. Give me your top 3 or top 5, favorite, not best, your favorite Latino boxers.
Of all time?
Of all time.
And do I have to rank them, or can I just spit them out?
Nah, man. I mean, we don't want to put you on a spot like that. We didn't prep these questions for you, but I know you've got some. And see, because that's the thing. You've got to have somebody that resonates with you, right? It's not like who's the best, because we're already biased, right? It's like, who's your favorite? That's more important to me.
Yeah. And that's why I like pound for pound lists that are like specific. Pound for pound what? You know what I'm saying? And I like this question because it's like your pound for pound favorite, not necessarily maybe only think about their accolades and their championships and what they did, but just culturally and like why they relate. So I like this question a lot for that reason, because it's more nuanced than just a pound for pound list. I gotta say, I started watching Chavez, so Chavez is my number 1. I put Chavez number 1. I would then go to Juan Manuel Marquez. The tetralogy that he gave us with Manny Pacquiao.
Ooh, come on.
Other fights. I got to put Maravilla, the great Argentino from, I'm not sure where in Argentina is from, but Sergio Maravilla Martinez. Like my favorite fight that he had was the one he had against Chavez Jr., fighting against Paul Williams in those 2 fights. Those are my top 3. And then because what Oscar De La Hoya did for me growing up, and I shared this with Oscar De La Hoya recently, amongst other things. I said to Oscar, the reason why I was able to make sense of who I was as a young boy growing up in Southeast Los Angeles and Southgate was because I saw you fight Chavez, and you in the Olympics were this guy that was at Garfield High School, which is a high school I ended up playing soccer against. You were Mexican but born in the U.S. like me. And there was something about you raising the flag at the Olympic Games, the U.S. and the Mexico flag, that really spoke to our experiences as being Chicanos in the U.S. The push and pull, the not Mexican enough for the Mexicans in Mexico, and all the xenophobia in America that denies us the status of being U.S. citizens, cultural citizens of this country. And so De La Hoya for me is big because of what he did to me, for me growing up, and the impact he had in my life. And then number 5, and again, recent fighters, like I don't know if it's too early, it's too soon. That's where like my historian, I'm like, I got to see where Canelo goes. I got to see where some of these like Mexican fighters of this era are going to do and go and take their careers in those directions. But if I had to do one last one, I'd say the Latino fighter, it's a toss-up between Tito Trinidad and Cotto. But as I say that out loud, Cotto would not have become who he became if it had not been for Tito Trinidad. And I'm going to go with Tito Trinidad as my 5th one. And I'll share a story about why that also happened. Because so when I interviewed Bernard Hopkins, the executioner, and I shared with him why I thought Bernard Hopkins was such an important figure in the boxing world, that in the sense of how we think about race and boxing. And I told him, I was like, when you fought against Tito Trinidad, and I was very heartbroken when he beat De La Hoya in 1999. But Tito's just always been such a fun fighter to watch. Like he's exciting. He takes risks. The fight he had with Mayorga was entertaining. He outmatched Mayorga, but Mayorga gave him a good fight that was fun to watch. I told Bernard, I said, when you fought against Tito and you promoted the fight, like you became public enemy number one because you knew you had to do that. Your style at the time was not fan favorite. It wasn't the most entertaining. You were trying to develop some kind of relevance in the boxing world because you were already champion, but you needed to get over that hump for people to really pay attention to you so that the big bucks could come. And what he did was, on not once, but on 2 occasions, snatched the Puerto Rican flag from Don and threw it on the ground to become like super villain. You know what I'm saying? He barely made it out of Puerto Rico alive. Came back. 9/11 took place. The fight got postponed. Then they fought the fight. Tito Trinidad got knocked out in the final round, and it was a very risky fight for Tito to take. But I love that he took that fight. And I told Bernard, what I love about what you did at the end is you took the microphone and you said, look, translate this for me. I want to go back to Puerto Rico. I want to apologize to the people of Puerto Rico, because at the end of the day, this man right here, and he points at Tito, he says, this man is a black man, just like me.
Wow.
That's 2001, right? 9/11, and in academia, we're just now kind of really doing a lot of work around Black and Latino coexisting, being part of that identity, right? That political story, the cultural story. And so when that happened, I told Bernard that what you did was very subtle and very quickly, but you informed the boxing world that Black and Latino can coexist and be one and not separate. And that was a very beautiful thing, very subtle, very ephemeral, very quick. But I love that moment because Tito, one of my favorite Latino fighters, Afro-Latinos, was part of that historic moment, or that powerful moment that I thought culturally boxing was teaching us something so
my gosh, yes. And you talk about how messages manifest and the storytelling, what a progressive the progressive insight by a legend, Bernard Hopkins. One of my favorite philosophers and boxers is Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson, I heard him recently say that, boxing isn't a tough man's sport. It's a thinking man's sport. And if a tough man comes into a boxing ring, that guy's going to get hurt. And so, these guys are like philosophers, they're mathematicians. I mean, they're geniuses in that ring. Boxing has gotten a bad rep for being a brutal sport, which it can be, right? On surface level, it can be a brutal sport. However, the philosophical aspect and the sweet science of it is understated from the layman's perspective or from the outside viewer. What would you say for those individuals? And I want to get back because listen, man, I'm almost offended that you didn't say Roberto Duran, my brother. I got to go back and you got to give an honorable mention, but let's go back.
Wait.
Because you didn't say Duran, my brother.
No, five would totally be Roberto Duran. And I'll say this. Politically, like, I don't know if you saw Hands of Stone, the movie.
I did see that, man. Usher Raymond.
Usher played Sugar Ray.
Sugar Ray.
And I love that movie because it was the first time that a movie was made. Because up until that point, a lot of the documentaries that were made were about, and they centered Sugar Ray Leonard. And Roberto was like a part of the story, or he played a supporting role. But this time, that movie, Robert De Niro played his trainer, and it goes into the backstory of why he really, really wanted to dethrone Sugar Ray Leonard. And it wasn't because he was a world champion. Roberto Duran, based on his lived experience, saw the occupation of the Panama Canal by U.S. imperial forces. He came of age seeing that kind of presence, that type of occupation in Panama. And so then for him to want to dethrone the symbol of American imperialism, which was embodied by the world champion, which happened to be at the time Sugar Ray Leonard, that's the backstory of that passion, that emotion, those feelings that he had at the end of the fight when he grabs his nuts and he's talking shit to the crowd, right? So you're right, man, because and that's Tyson. That's one of Tyson's favorite fighters too.
Yeah.
I mean, I left out a lot of names, so in the comments
It's
section,
all good. Yeah, no, it's all good. I'm putting you on the spot with these random questions. And so, no, I mean, but listen, that's what you just described, you know, fighting oppressive colonial forces and how that wins us over, right? In our bloodline, in our veins. I mean, we come from warriors, people that were guardians, people that were protectors, people that had to fight. My son is 8 years old. He practices Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I told him, I said, look, you're on these mats rolling around. You think this is about arm bars and chokes. It's not. It's about life. And anything you want in life, you're going to have to fight for. And that goes for anyone, right? I understand getting a PhD is not easy.
No.
Exactly. You're going to have some days where you're fighting against yourself. Where, man, I got to go study. Man, I got to read. Man, I got to write. My partner, she's a dancer. She is recording over and over and over and over some pieces that she really ain't that fond of. And you got to fight and grapple with your mind. If I want to be the best, if I want to do something that hasn't been done, if I want to, you know, tackle my goals and my dreams, I'm going to have to fight for it. And we can't act like, you know, this country, this world has been fair to people of color, to men of color. You talked about Bernard Hopkins. Again, I'm not going to say, you know, why people ended up in prison was always, you know, incorrect or false or against, you know, poor reasoning and judgment. However, these guys represent a further sense of storytelling and redemption and honor through that storytelling that they manifest through their physical fighting and boxing.
Right. I'm glad you shared that about Bernard too, because I mean, Bernard was sentenced to a long-term sentencing as a child, right? And when I met Bernard the first time, I told him there's a scholar by the name of Antonio Gramsci, and he has this concept of organic intellectual, and it's like you don't need a PhD, you don't need a formalized education to be an intellect, to be an organic intellectual. Like for Bernard, I'm like, dude, you have so much knowledge, wisdom, and intellect to share. And I think that of a lot of boxers have that, and also something that Avery Gordon calls complex personhood. When we think about boxing as this brutal sport, when we think of boxing as this hyper masculine or heteronormative or hyper capitalistic endeavor, and people kind of look at it and want no part of that because of how those things are reinforced, right? And they are. The hyper masculinity, heterosexuality, and homophobia, all those things are reinforced in boxing. But what industry, what capitalistic endeavor in this world doesn't also reinforce them? Right. And so I often tell people, I say, all of those things are true about boxing. But then if we limit our imagination to boxing just being these negative things, then we lose sight of how boxing for some affords them dignity. When I recently I spoke to Andrew Cancio, right? El Chango, who became world champion when he beat Machado at the Fantasy Springs Casino in the Palm Springs, Indio area. And he said it wasn't a big crowd. It was about a few thousand. But that was my first championship fight. And I didn't get paid well for that fight, he said. But hearing the people chant Andrew or Cancio or El Chango, that recognition, that validation was everything for him. And if we limit our imaginations to all the negative parts of boxing, we also miss out on the stories of how fighters fight against power, against colonialism, or against racism, against sexism, right? These are things that are happening in ring entrances, right? Based on my research. These are things that are happening in one-on-one conversations with fighters and the media or at press conferences, right? There's all these things that boxing also does. So for someone to say, you know, boxing one day should, you know, boxing right now should be abolished. We shouldn't have boxing because it's so brutal. It is brutal. But think about the 25,000 boxers registered around the world that find some purpose, even if it's in a 4-round fight, getting paid $400, right? There's something there that affords a person who comes from a background of being downtrodden, of being working poor, of being marginalized.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, brother. And listen, I'm from Michigan. I love my home state of Michigan. I always rep in Michigan. And one of the things that came to mind when you're talking about fighting for dignity and respect, we have to give a shout out. I hope she's watching the GOAT, Clarissa Shields, because on paper, her resume is better than a whole lot of things that we've seen in fight sports, in combat sports. Clarissa Shields comes from Flint, Michigan, brother. And I don't know if you know about Flint, Michigan, Flint water crisis. My homie Guylon has helped raise money to send water, down there to get some people healthy again back out there. But man, people got to fight for freedom in this country still. And in Flint, Michigan, Clarissa Shields, she manifests that, a physical manifestation. And even now, fighting for respect, right? Feeling, I'm not getting acknowledged because I'm a woman, right? Mm-hmm. Someone on this channel, you got to watch Carolina Teague's show here at VodPod Media, A League of Her Own. Great knowledge about sports, basketball, football, boxing, but she don't get the looks that she deserves because she's a woman. At least that's part of I've heard from her story, right? So it's like, man, everybody's out here fighting and grappling, with something. And so, that's important as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you shout out Clarissa because, and again, it's a very subtle thing that she does. But if you look at the photos for her fights, when the news broke out of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, right? Clarissa, if you look at pictures for her fights and her ring entrances, right, and her fights themselves, she always wears a blue piece, a blue hair piece, braided in her hair to represent the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. In an interview, she said, "I'm not going to stop wearing that blue streak of hair until Flint gets clean water."
Come on now. Right?
And that it's subtle. But there's an entire
that's the messaging,
message that is there that Clarissa can articulate if people ask. So sometimes I tell people, it's like, as a researcher, I'm doing it right, but for media, for fans, for people in the industry, sometimes I think we need to shift the way we see boxing and ask questions that are risky, that might not get you the same amount of likes, the same amount of views, but these are questions that I believe that boxers want to answer. Right? The
Absolutely.
What they politically stand for, what they're fighting for. It's a good moment to really begin to think about what it looks like to pivot and create a new paradigm in terms of how we engage with boxers who I think teach us so much just because of the struggled situations they emerge from. I mean, that's Lou DiBella told me, why the fuck would a rich kid fight?
Oh yeah, they ain't gonna fight. They ain't gonna fight. They ain't got nothing to fight for.
Exactly. And so the having that very particular lived experience, like, it's rare you meet a fighter who comes from some kind of middle class affluence. Like Jake Paul is, he comes from Disney. He's not coming from the same experiences that a Darrell comes from, right? The brothers from Michigan. He's not coming from the experience that Floyd Mayweather experienced, Chavez experienced, right? Those are very, very distinct. And I think from those lived experiences of boxers, we can learn so much.
Absolutely. And again, that's, we could talk about Jake Paul. I didn't really want to, go into that subject, right? But, that's not saying he's not a decent athlete that could put together a couple of combinations, right, in his youth, but I look at Jake Paul and I'm wondering, what is he fighting for? A guy like you mentioned, Julio Cesar Chavez, a guy like, Oscar De La Hoya, it feels like they're just fighting for something else, right? Now, speaking of paradigm shifts, I understand, and I'm very happy for your success, all of your success, brother. I want to acknowledge that you have an upcoming event that you're facilitating, a sort of panel discussion on what boxing owes its fighters and champions. Tell us a little bit about the event.
Yeah, absolutely. It's through the Zocalo Public Square. They're affiliated with Arizona State University, and they're located out here in downtown Los Angeles at the Old Herald Examiner building, which is where the panel is going to take place. And so I've been working with them to put together a panel that addresses the future of boxing being a cultural force, boxing providing an opportunity for many fighters to earn money, to get themselves out of poverty, to get themselves out of certain socioeconomic statuses, But what does it look like when we have a conversation about the future of boxing, when we take into consideration the worker, the boxer? And so this panel is going to talk about and get to things that relate to compensation, that gets to benefits and protections, really informing an audience about, a boxer is not an employee because they have no employer. They're independent contractors who get contracted by a promoter. And so I think for me, the panel, what I'm very excited about is that we'll be able to talk about some of the inner workings of the boxing industry so that people have a better understanding and can be a little bit more educated about the sport that they love, that they consume. And Kaylee Reese is going to be on the panel, Sergio Mora, and they're both former world champion boxers. Kaylee's a current world champion boxer. And then we have Andy Foster, who's the executive director of the California State Athletic Commission, who's in charge of maintaining the safety, the well-being, and the fairness of boxing and of boxers. And so he's in a position of direct power to influence regulations and policies that are implemented in California in the name of safety and fairness and wellness for fighters.
Yeah, so it looks like a great event, and I'm glad you're putting that on because, again, when you think about, the additional layers and aspects of what we should be doing for fighters, that's important as well because, again, independent contractors, we could talk about all day about, work and labor in this country, but that's something else that the fighters are fighting for, right? To have a good, living, right? To take care of their families, and this is their profession and sport. And so it should be treated like no other when we talk about compensation.
Absolutely. And my thing is, with the work that I do, I first and foremost do the work that I do for the worker, for the boxer, right? And boxers have a small window. We call it shelf life, right? They got maybe 5 years of earning good money if they make it to the 10 round, 12 round level of boxing. But majority of fighters don't reach those levels. And so the reality, the data, right, is telling us that it's only a select few that will be able to achieve that level of fights where the money is decent / lucrative. Then what does it mean for the majority of boxers who toil in a sport that won't ever be able to fight for a large purse, right? And so if that's the reality based on the data that we've collected, then what does it look like for thinking about protections and benefits for the workers, the fighters, that they're the reason, like just like any other sport, the NFL can't function without the players, the NBA can't function without the players, and boxing is the same way. Like boxing would not exist without the boxers. And furthermore, boxing would not, a Canelo, a Floyd Mayweather, an Oscar De La Hoya, a Manny Pacquiao would not be able to exist, or you wouldn't be able to create a fighter of that level without a fighter that took an L against them, right?
Yeah.
And those fighters that fight in obscurity and great precarity, what benefits and protections are in place for them? Because they are, I'm advancing this concept called the most vulnerable prize fighters, which are the fighters that engage in this economy of boxing that don't ever see paydays beyond $2,000, $3,000 per fight. I have a fighter that I've interviewed that had 5 fights in 1 year, and he cleared $6,000 in one fiscal year. And so those are the fighters that are the most vulnerable prize fighters, but they're also the MVPs of this sport, because without them, a superstar in the making needs a W, needs a win off of a fighter like that. And that's the reality, because if it's a one-on-one sport, you're always going to have some winners, and you're going to have a lot of losers too. And not losers that they're bums or anything like that, but they're losers in the sense of an L on their record. And the more losses you have, the less value you have in this market system that rewards the winners and then rewards the top earners, which are like less than 1% in the entire boxing industry.
Yeah, it's an interesting ecosystem and stratosphere. I wonder too, about what those boxers are going to do after their careers are over. Right. What do they do? Do they go into training and coaching? Do they open up their own gyms? Do they go work a 9 to 5? Right. Do they open up another sort of family business? That's important as well. And so I think, part of the work you're doing is getting those young boxers to think about that. You're in this for the long run. What's next for you in, the trajectory of your career?
For me, I mean, right now I'm a research fellow at UCLA. So I'm working out of the Institute for the Research on Labor and Employment, and I'll be there until the summer of 2024. And in the fall of 2024, I'll be starting a tenure track position at Loyola Marymount University as an assistant professor in their Chicana and Chicano and Latino Studies department. And this is the first time I share that bit of information. So this is exclusive news coming in right now that I'll be starting a professorship tenure track job at LMU in the fall of 24.
Well, congratulations. Hats off to you. I know, we've been talking about hooking up and having one of these talks, and you're always welcome back at VodPod for any of your projects, any fight analysis, insight, news. As we start to wind down tonight, again, appreciate your time. We'll give you an opportunity to kind of give us some closing thoughts, but again, always a pleasure. We again admire those fighters and people that have created their own lane. Here with our partner, Ofelia Delgado Law, who is a fighter. If you've been hit by a car or a truck, folks, anywhere in the state of Texas, you need to call Ofelia Delgado. She'll fight for you. And what we're doing here, we're creating media in this space. We have shot 68 episodes of this show week after week. Here in downtown San Antonio with the help of Gylan Jackson, producer, creator here. And we've been on a roll, man, but it's about shaping, the landscape. It's about providing our spin on things and speaking from our hearts and speaking from in a black and brown centered experience, man, which I think is important. And so we appreciate you coming through and blessing us on the mic and sharing a little bit more about your story. We'll let you get some closing thoughts, man, then we're going to take it home.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. It was for me, I mean, time flies when I do these
quick, bro.
Engagements. I didn't even know it was already we're already wrapping up. So I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do, bro. The conversations that you engage in. I mean, right off the bat, a lot of chemistry, a lot of passion, a lot of engagement that I felt during these last 45 minutes that we've been talking. So I wanted to say thank you for that. For folks that want to engage with my work or just reach out and contact me about my work, I'm at Boxing Intellect on Instagram as well as on Twitter. And for me, the final thoughts, you mentioning that you're in San Antonio, talking about Latino boxers, and me probably getting a lot of critique on the comment section for not naming some of the fans out there favorite Latino fighters. But I gotta shout one out that maybe folks wouldn't even think to shout out, that is in San Antonio, that's in your backyard. It's Carlos Famoso Hernandez, and I gotta put him as my 5B, as my favorite Latino fighters, because for those that don't know, he's the one and only fighter that scored an official knockdown against Floyd Mayweather Jr. And Carlos was also the first and only to date world boxing champion, IBF, International Boxing Federation world champion of Salvadoran descent. So Central America, shout out. And Carlos lives in San Antonio. And so my final thoughts is I definitely want to come back on the show, but I want to go in the studio.
Oh yeah.
Because my plans as a researcher is to go out to San Antonio. This has been something that's been in the making for the last year. I want to go out to San Antonio to meet up with Carlos and interview him for a project that I'm working on. It would be like an oral history, probably 3-hour long interview with Carlos. And, if I'm going to be in San Antonio, it just makes sense for us to link up again in person. And who knows, maybe do something special with Carlos if he's down for it.
Oh, yeah, and the studio is going to be the place for you to shoot it at, too. I can't wait to see all the tools and all the toys that we have here. I'm glad that you mentioned that because there are so many boxers, right, and so many fighters that we've forgotten about almost. You know, when you were talking about some of your favorite boxers, man, it bring me back memory lane. One that I didn't speak on, but you mentioned was De La Hoya because, again, he meant so much because he wasn't from Mexico. You know, he was like us. He was born in the United States. And so maybe he wasn't fully accepted in Mexico. And we knew he wasn't a white boy from the United States, right? And so he was like us. And during that 90s era when he had his run, even though he took the loss from Trinidad, I mean, the guy was a fighter. He could fight. He would fight the best, too. I remember when he fought Pacquiao, people were like, what are you doing fighting Pacquiao? And he took the fight anyway. You know what I mean? Inspiring fighter, man, who could fight in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And then even like it's funny because yesterday I was just at a coffee shop in the Arts District in downtown LA and I ran into Sinisa Estrada, you know, super bad, who's the world champion right now, got 2 of the 4 belts in her weight division. You know, shouting out the women too. You know, we shouted out Clarissa Shields earlier, but even thinking about like the women of Texas boxing too. And, you know, we got to shout out Marlene Esparza, who's out there, former I think bronze medalist in the Olympic Games in London, the first time that they had women at the Olympic Games. So it just makes me think about the different like names, like you were saying, and the contributions that they've made in the sport. Another one I think is so important because when we think about pound for pound lists, one of my favorite pound for pound lists that I like to name are the pound for pound rebels of boxing. You know, when we think about what does a rebel mean, like, right? Jack Johnson was a rebel, right? Like his reputation for dating and marrying white women during the Jim Crow era. That's some rebel shit right there.
Oh, yeah.
Driving cars, being one of the only, maybe the few black men to own a car during the early 1900s, and speeding and getting pulled over by cops and paying 2 fines because he said, I'm going to drive back this way anyway, so let me just pay you twice for this fine because I'm going to break it later, right? The rebels of boxing. One of the rebels I got to shout out is Mi Vida Loca, Johnny Tapia from New Mexico, right? That was one of those fighters too that, like, when we think about Mexican Americans fighting against each other and one emerging as the good guy, one emerging as the bad guy, you got to think about Oscar de la Hoya against Fernando Vargas. Yeah. And when Johnny Tapia fought against Paulie Alaya, I believe it was his name, right? That same good versus evil narrative was used. They had metal detectors. They had cops lined up at this arena in New Mexico. And I just feel like Mi Vida Loca, Johnny Tapia, was also, like, he was a rebel. He was a bad boy. He was a homeboy. Some would call him a cholo, whatnot. Struggle with substance abuse. But some of the moments that I remember of Johnny Tapia have got to be the most tender, right? How gentle he was with his opponents. I remember he beat a Salvadoran boxer once, and he beat him, won the fight, and instead of celebrating, he lifted that boxer on his shoulder.
Yeah. And
that I remember, and those moments just seem very special to me. And boxing, there's millions of those types of examples. We just gotta kind of pay attention to sometimes and look for those moments.
Yeah, and again, we're talking, you know, just boxing, but I know you know a little bit about combat sports altogether, whether it be mixed martial arts, wrestling, which a lot of our people are getting into and have been into for a long time. All of this and more, when we get you in the studio right here on the east side of downtown, you're going to love. Have you been to San Antonio before?
I've been a couple of times, but just like in the downtown area where the conferences take place. I would want to venture out.
Oh, yeah, we're going to have you here. So it's always a pleasure, my brother. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at VodPod Media. You are up there, my brother. You're going to be plastered on the wall as one of our favorite guests because you're right, man. You just got that good vibe, that good spirit, that fighter spirit, and you're putting on for the sport and for our fighters just along those same lines, man. So I salute you and your work, and it's all love, man. Much respect.
Hey, man. Thank you so much for me again, bro. I appreciate the work that you do, man. I'm excited for the next time we get to link up.
All right, man. And the next time you see De La Hoya, tell him to stop spending money on abs. What's wrong with you, man? Come on, Oscar.
Hey, man, he just turned 50. He's looking good, man. He's got that beachbody.com right now, bro.
Hey, take it home, Gylan. We love y'all. See y'all next Tuesday.
Peace out, everybody. Thank you.